Hello, everyone, and welcome to Gaming Mechanics podcast, where Mark and I talk about games and how they work, and why we love them. Most importantly, my name's Greg, and I'm joined as ever by my host Mark.
Hello.
And today we are going to be talking about FPSs.
That's right.
Mark, you want to intro today's topic?
I wouldn't call myself an expert, but I have been playing FPSs for many years, and recently started playing Overwatch. And in some ways, it felt like coming home. Growing up on games like Halo and Tribes, arena shooters are just a genre that I really appreciate and enjoy. But today we're going to open up the field a little bit, and we're going to talk about shooters as a genre. The two main games we're going to be focusing on are PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds, henceforth known as PUBG, because it's a mouthful otherwise, and Overwatch. We may talk a little bit about Left 4 Dead, but most of that will probably be for the next episode, actually. So me and Greg have recently started playing Left 4 Dead together.
Cursed Steam Summer Sale, or Blessed, I don't know, it's fantastic.
It's a toss-up, right?
Oh god, that game's fun. It's just fun.
Slow down, Greg. Next episode, we'll talk about it. We will.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Well, I wanted to launch off just by talking about the lineage of these two games, which they actually have less in common than you might think, considering they're both shooters. Other than the obvious...
And both wildly popular right now.
Right, which is one of the reasons we wanted to cover this topic, was because both of these games are really popular, but they seem to fill very different niches. I don't hear a lot of Overwatch players talking about PUBG, and I don't get the sense there's a lot of people playing PUBG who also play Overwatch. I just don't think there's a lot of overlap in the communities, which is pretty interesting, because they, on the surface, to somebody who'd never played games before, they definitely would put these games in the same bucket, right? I mean, they would definitely group these together.
Yeah, in general, probably just looking at.
In terms of lineage, both Overwatch and PUBG, I'm going to trace back to Doom and Wolfenstein 3D as kind of their early roots. Pretty much every early shooter can say that, at least in terms of popularizing the shooter genre. From there, they split. Overwatch goes the way of Quake, which is a early arena shooter, and then follows in Half-Life, which spawns Team Fortress, Counter-Strike Half-Life 2, and then that gives way to Team Fortress 2, which most people would probably think is the most recognizably close sibling to Overwatch. But actually, going over this timeline, Greg brought up Project Titan, which I did not know anything about. So, Greg, do you want to talk for a minute about how Project Titan might fit in there between Team Fortress 2 and Overwatch?
Yeah, for sure. So, Project Titan was the canceled and failed Blizzard project that never actually made it out of development stage. I think it was back in 2007 or 8 when Blizzard had slowly been moving around a lot of their senior developers, artists, personnel to a different unknown project that was massive in size. Was the final dev team was somewhere around 140 people, which is pretty darn big. And Blizzard at that point was riding pretty darn high across the board. Obviously, WoW was a tremendous success. StarCraft 2, Diablo 3 were all in the works and coming through, and pretty much they hadn't released an unsuccessful game, certainly not commercially. And Project Titan was going to be another MMO, actually, in large part, that was going to be hopefully not compete at all with WoW, but it was going to be a shooter-based, kind of Destiny-like, actually, where you're first person out in the world and in combat, and then you have these kind of social player hubs where you're in third person and can do other things. It's going to be kind of a similar, very similar aesthetic to Overwatch, and I think a lot of the world building was very similar, but it's going to be class-based. With progression, so a lot of MMO kind of RPG things. But the project actually, even with all of these developers and all the resources Blizzard had, failed. They were never able to get it to the point where it was going to be publishable. The way they talked about it was they never found fun. The fun in it was very muddled. It was very confused. It was very difficult to actually step into and play. And so the Project Titan, despite being this huge resource sink, and I think they spent something like 5 years on it, they were never able to get to a publishable version. And the story that Chris Menson, who was the creative director at Blizzard for a long time, and then Jeff Kaplan, who's the game director for Overwatch now, tells that basically upon coming to the conclusion that the game was lost, Project Titan wasn't going to happen, they were given 6 weeks by Blizzard to salvage something from it, salvage a brand new game. And if not, then everything was going to be scrapped, and they were just going to they were gonna put put all the dev team into different other Blizzard projects, and it was going to be really, really demoralizing. And so in that 6 weeks, they they came up with Overwatch. Actually, they salvaged this idea of a class system, but reduced it to
Wow, yeah.
from a progression system to just totally 100% set things. And they used a lot of, like I said, the art aesthetic. Um, and particularly at that point too, just the team was so beaten down that they really wanted to build something really positive and very hopeful. And so that's where you kind of get this tone of Overwatch. Is a lot of people compare it to Pixar, even, right, in terms of just it's one, it's aesthetic, but two, its ability to just be generally fun and not kind of dark and gritty like most shooters of the age. And obviously, you see tons of Team Fortress 2 in terms of the tone there, but also they talked about MOBAs in terms of Defense of the 8, Dota 2,
Right.
and League, and Here's the Storm, which was in development at that point. Trying to get together team compositions and the idea of set locked in heroes that had a set group of abilities and they could combine. And that's kind of how Overwatch came. So it took all these FPS, inspirations, like you were talking about, Mark, in terms of like the classics, and then kind of combined them with this failed MMO world and some MOBA dynamics, which were really popular at the time. And this amalgamation somehow came out to be Overwatch, which is arguably one of the most popular games of the past year worldwide. So pretty crazy story. Could have really fallen on its face and failed entirely. And I think it's really testament to the Blizzard devs that they were able to pull something out of all of that mess and were able to pick out the parts that were going to work and turned it into this cult, this iconic new game, basically.
Completely new intellectual property. I mean, Blizzard
Yep.
hasn't done any new IP for almost 20 years. And to
Yep.
have come out with a game that really shook up the shooter genre, it kind of took advantage of the popularity of MOBAs to some extent.
Yep.
Um,
Very
it
much so.
took, I would say, hopped on the online competitive scene.
Very
Um,
much so.
I think that they landed themselves in so many good positions, and they stuck the landing. And I think it was just so
Yep.
impressive the way that Overwatch was designed. And you talked about how it is hopeful. Blizzard devs have talked about wanting to make an optimistic future, is what they
Yep.
wanted for Overwatch.
Just so different from any other future-based piece of media. I mean, just think about like just the rise of post-apocalypse, right?
Oh
Like
yeah.
even like now, like how many hopeful, optimistic futures have been portrayed in media over the past like decade?
Oh yeah, no,
Not too many.
it's so low. Like it's
Exactly.
incredibly easy to list off dystopian future settings.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are not very many optimistic futures.
Anyway.
Overwatch, I would even say, is brighter than Team Fortress 2 in terms of its
Yeah.
aesthetic.
Totally.
Team Fortress 2, I think, is a little bit more cynical and self-referential than
Yeah.
Overwatch.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Like, exactly right. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, they managed to make a game that didn't feel cynical, which is insane for a shooter where you're just literally shooting people.
Right. Like, what a strange game to like make with this aesthetic. Like, nobody's
Totally.
surprised when Nintendo makes like a feel-good Yoshi game where you're a ball of yarn. But for Blizzard to come up with a shooter
Right.
that where authenticity and optimism are center stage is kind of
Yeah.
crazy.
It's remarkable. Really is.
In terms of what they borrowed from different games, I mean, Quake was obviously the first arena shooter.
Right.
Team Fortress, we see a little bit more of the class refinements with the different abilities given to each class.
Hmm.
There's even some abilities which directly inspire Overwatch characters.
Yeah.
Think about Sombra's invisibility and the spy from
Hmm.
Team
Yep.
Fortress. Or there's a lot of overlap there. I would say Counter Strike really brought.
Objective based.
I think that's a huge part of what Counter Strike contributed to Overwatch was this
Mm.
zone-based objective that everybody was kind of working toward, where kills were important, but they really weren't the core of what you were trying to accomplish.
Exactly. Yep.
Unlike Quake, where there are different
Just
modes,
deathmatch. Quake,
but
right?
that's what Quake is known for, is the
Right.
deathmatch, where it's just trying to rack up kills.
Right.
So yeah, moving into PUBG, and its lineage is actually a bit more complicated. There's more to explain. We
Yeah,
still
man.
get
That
kicked
was,
off with Wolfenstein 3D and Doom, and then it pretty much forks from there from Quake we instead of going into Quake, follows more in the vein of the original Rainbow Six as a
Yeah.
tactical shooter.
Yeah.
And tactical shooters have just tended to be more third person. Um,
Hmm.
I actually think tactical versus arena shooters is a better distinction than first versus third person,
Yeah.
because
Sure.
we will talk about what the camera perspective does to the player later on in the episode, but I
Right.
think you can have tactical shooters that are first person or
Yeah.
third person, but actually they would be closer relatives than they would be to something like Overwatch. So.
In fact, PUBG you can switch between the two. It's just almost everyone uses third person because it's arguably a better, more intuitive way to play a tactical game like that.
Cool. I mean, that makes sense. I didn't know that.
Yep.
Okay, so yeah, starting off with with original Rainbow Six, that actually does. I still want to relate it to Counter Strike, but for different reasons actually. The idea of having to buy and spend resources on guns, having limited ammo.
Yeah.
Um,
Limited resources. Sure.
you die pretty quickly in Counter Strike. It's not like Overwatch where you can take 60 bullets and as long as Mercy's next to you, you're fine.
Right.
So not really for the arena part, or not really for the objective part of it, but for the fragility of your character and
High lethality.
the realness of needing to buy body armor, of being able to pull out a knife and shank somebody at a close distance, things like that.
I think shanking's more prison based than like combat knife. Like when the SEALs are training, they don't have a shanking like portion of the training.
All right,
So you
recruits,
get
today you're
close and
going to learn how to shank. I have
You
never
get
been
close
through
and you pull out
basic
your shiv and you hit him
training.
in the kidney.
Make sure
Anyway.
you pee blood. All right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So from there, I would say that the lineage ties into Call of Duty, and then go
Really?
to the yeah, I think so. Just because of the realism, but now moving toward
Maybe
more
aesthetically. Yeah.
a massive number of people playing in a game like Call of Duty.
Mhm.
And Battlefield actually takes it up to the next level, which is the next game in the list. But
Right.
yeah, sort of this realistic, looking for weapons.
Sure, I can see it.
Battlefield introducing way more players onto the field, and then Arma
Right.
2, which is actually where this whole crazy story gets started.
Right.
So Arma 2 is more like Battlefield, and it's open world, like planet side.
Right.
And from there, Arma 2, there was a mod made called DayZ, and then there was a mod of that mod done by Player Unknown, also known as Brendan Green. He made a mod called the Battle Royale mod of DayZ.
Wasn't he involved in Daisy's development as well?
He was, yeah. He
Or was
helped
he
out with
H1Z1? I forget.
He also did H1Z1. He's been very
Okay,
involved with
gotcha.
this whole genre. It's funny, he's actually
Gotcha.
been credited with the birth of the genre
Yeah.
that all these games kind of fit into. But he made the Battle Royale mod of DayZ,
Yeah.
popularized that, and then left to go work for Microsoft to make H1Z1, and then left Microsoft to make PUBG for the Xbox
Right.
One, and which subsequently went to other platforms. But
Right.
so he's kind of run through this whole genre. But it was funny to me because DayZ later on became its own game, which is a
Right.
totally different thing. So there's the DayZ mod of Arma 2, and then there's DayZ, the standalone game. One of those had Brendan Green, and one of them did not. So, uh, and it doesn't really matter because the DayZ standalone is pretty much a direct port. It doesn't need a lot of creativity. It just needed somebody who was faithful to the original. But anyway, so that's the whole convoluted story of where PUBG came from.
And he ended up doing PUBG because he had so many experiences of trying to make a game, and he had so many, kind of restrictions on him, both either from Microsoft or from the Arma guys for DayZ, and he finally just wanted to make exactly the version of this game that he wanted to make. Right, that was the idea between finally making this one.
Right. Yeah, and that is why he made the same game essentially three
Three
times.
times. Yeah.
At least three times. I mean,
Yeah.
a couple of them were mods, but
And every single
I'll
one of them was
credit him
so
with at
friggin'
least
popular
three.
when it came out too. Like each one of those was like at least Twitch wise was at the top of Twitch, like
Yeah, I mean,
consistently.
you say what you want about Microsoft, but they're not stupid. They know when something's a good investment, and they snapped up DayZ real quick. I mean,
Mhm.
H1Z1 followed after just 3 years later.
Yeah.
It was not very long. So yeah, it was hugely popular and people took notice of it. But nobody had ever thought to make a game like that. I mean, he really did birth a genre. It's crazy.
So as a result of all of these, kind of these dual lineages here, even though we can trace them back to a general common ancestor, these games are just absolutely both mechanically, thematically, genetically, if you will, extremely different, and do represent really the two ends of the FPS side right now. I mean, I would say again, largely skewed towards Twitch viewership as just kind of the main metric for what I'm using as perception of popularity as opposed to sales necessarily. But they're really kind of the two FPS. I mean, Destiny is pretty big, but that's another niche one, and has certainly
Yeah.
waned over the years.
It would be
So
interesting actually to talk about the genre that Destiny kind of fills in
mhm.
this, like the open world shooters, and just how many bad starts that genre had. I mean, there was just, so many people thought it was a good idea, but it turned out to be really hard to do. But that's a
Yeah,
tangent, so
yeah, for sure.
at least for this episode.
Destiny, even itself, being kind of the prime example of it, launched to extremely mixed reviews. I think partially because of classic overpromising and under delivering, but it has since over time become massively refined and is very highly regarded now, and a lot of people are super excited for Destiny 2. But it took like years to get that to the point where it was playable, basically, or at least was able to be highly regarded and a respectable example of that genre.
Yeah, full disclosure, I've never played any Destiny.
That's fine. A final little side note, almost tragically, of talking about Overwatch. There was also a game released very close to Overwatch called Battleborn, and it's very similar in terms of being a first-person class-based shooter with almost an identical aesthetic, even more Pixar-y, and just apps. And I remember people were looking at Overwatch and Battleborn and being like, okay, these look like identical games. And a lot of people, I think, originally actually even were suspecting that Battleborn was going to be more successful. And it absolutely just creamed by Overwatch, unfortunately. So let's pour some water out for Battleborn, our fallen brethren, because probably that would have been a highly successful game had Overwatch not just taken the world by storm.
Yeah, that's rough. That's like when your movie
So
comes out at the same time as a Star Wars
yeah,
film. It's
exactly.
like, well,
So R.I.P.
good game.
Battleborn.
Uh, yeah, and I think that that actually ties into what we're talking about, how these games fill different niches.
Right.
Because if they didn't, I think one would have killed the other.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
For sure.
Battleborn and Overwatch couldn't have both succeeded
Yes. Yep. Very much so.
because the network effects on that genre are too strong.
Yep. Especially with something that's so team based. I mean, Overwatch. We kind of touched on this a little bit. One thing I absolutely adore about Overwatch, and the reason I play it more so than like CS:GO or really any other shooter, is the fact that it's entirely team based, objective based. There's no death mode, no deathmatch mode in at least competitive
Right.
or quick play. It's entirely cooperative, which is also absolutely infuriating many times because the internet sucks. But is also
That's
just such a
true.
unique, cool thing, um, and yeah, that's an extremely important part of that DNA. And I think the fact that it is so team based and so kind of personality based that like you said, that social network effect is really important for it to thrive, and of course it has.
Hmm.
So there maybe was not room for two of those types of games.
Let's go into character design since we've already touched on the aesthetics and stuff like that. I will say from the outset, me and Greg are both more fans of a game like Overwatch than we are of PUBG.
Oh yeah, I
Just it
support
fits
it.
our play style and our what we're looking for in a game more. I think they are both high quality games, and obviously both games are adored by many hundreds of thousands of people. So anyway, that's kind of the perspective we're speaking from. We will know more about
Yeah,
Overwatch. We want to give this a fair shake in terms of the
for
comparisons.
sure.
So
That's important that you said that. I've played uh, hundreds of hours of Overwatch over the past year, and have watched maybe 5 hours of PUBG. So yeah, that's I've done some research and watched some stuff about player unknowns, but obviously am more an Overwatch fan. Which isn't to say I don't like PUBG. It just wouldn't be the game I play. I'm more
right,
academically
exactly.
interested in it than as a player.
Fair enough. So yeah, why don't we talk a little bit about the character design in Overwatch?
Yeah, it's
Because
fantastic.
I was recently watching. It
It's
is.
insane.
It's amazing. I was recently watching a YouTube video about the conveying personality through animation, which I would encourage anybody to Google and look up. It's 15 minutes. If you want to watch the source material, which is a presentation at GDC by Blizzard, which is an hour long, that's pretty hardcore. There, I can say after having watched that video, the 15-minute summary is pretty much what you
Yeah,
want.
yeah, and there's also we'll get into both character design, gameplay aesthetically, as well as some sound design stuff. And there's a suite. I don't know if you can find this anymore, but either last BlizzCon, I believe, they did an entire panel on just Overwatch sound design, which I think was one of the ones they made public, as opposed to needing a digital
Oh,
pass.
cool. I didn't
And they
see
had
that.
the sound engineers, and were able to talk about both. Just technically how they did a lot of the sounds, as well as gameplay wise, and how they wanted that to integrate into the mechanics of the game and make sound actually important as opposed to just kind of a filler. So that's again, if go straight to the horse's mouth on some of this stuff, but if you don't, then Mark and I are here to summarize and extrapolate.
That's right. Cool. So, what would be your favorite character design
Oh
in
Lord, man.
Overwatch, Greg?
Um,
Is it hard for you to come up with that on the
well,
spot?
yeah, dude. I mean, they're just this is it really is so unique. I mean, it is they nail the ability to really know two characters feel alike in playing. Um,
Mm-hmm.
they were able to limit, and it's interesting too. Like that Magic, they're at 25 now with release of Doomfist, or the announcement of Doomfist anyway. But that kind of magic number of not too many heroes and not too few. Oh boy, character design wise, I think Reinhardt is a stroke of genius. Being able to integrate a largely melee and big crusading knight archetype into a game like Overwatch is brilliant.
Yeah, without making him feel like
Yeah,
just
totally. Yeah,
useless.
just
There's,
stupid.
and that's one of the things I like about Overwatch is because there's several characters that really easily could have been
Oh yeah, very much
useless.
so. I think the uniqueness of Ana's kit, having a sniper healer, damage dealer, damage over time kind of combo, utility characters is brilliant. I think Lucio's design is insane as well. Just the amount of different ways that he's able to be played, both aggressively, passively, all of his movement abilities. I'm just gonna go through the list, man. I'm just gonna start naming everyone. But Bastion's not a good design. How about that? That's a simple one. That's just a term. I'm not impressed by that.
Really? Okay, so that was actually one of the ones I was going to mention
Oh
as a.
god, of course.
Now, I wouldn't necessarily say as like a brilliant design, but I think as one that could have been useless.
That's true.
Like the
Well, he is
balancing,
useless
I
in
think
competitive
on
for what it's
Bastion.
worth. But
Okay, fine, fair enough.
yeah, but
But I think the balancing on Bastion had to be so fine tuned in order to make him feel like because mobility is such an important thing. So if you're
huge.
sacrificing mobility, you've got to be pretty powerful. Like that's got to be you've got to be giving somebody something that's worth sacrificing
Yeah,
mobility for. And
useless.
on the competitive field, it sounds like it's still not worth it.
Precisely.
And it's just so hard to get it's so hard to get that tuning right across all difficulty levels and competition levels.
Probably impossible, actually.
Yeah, it probably is. It would have to scale in some weird way that I don't want to think about how you try to accomplish. But at the levels that I play at, Bastion is viable,
Oh, true.
and
Probably overpowered. Even.
he actually feels really good to camp at a point and mow down
Oh
enemies
my god,
with.
it feels so
And
great.
it doesn't.
It makes me feel.
It,
It simultaneously feels pleasurable, and I just feel like a bad person.
yeah, that's
I'm
true
just like I'm
too.
sorry. Like I apologize as I'm mowing down these poor players who just poke out their heads for 10 seconds and just get erased from existence. Like I feel bad, but it
Exactly.
feels so good.
Yeah, but the fact that it's strong enough that you actually still want to play Bastion, even though most of the time when you're actually doing important things as Bastion, you can't
Correct.
move.
Yeah, yeah. No,
You can
that's a good
just
point. Trying to fine tune that. So yeah, they actually ended up iterated on Bastion a ton. So that what you're touching on the fact that it was a very fine line of having to figure out how to make him feel powerful but not too powerful. I think hardening for Blizzard. Originally they had when he deployed, he had a shield actually that he would deploy, like it was connected to him like Reinhardt's barrier. So he wouldn't take any damage until that was broken, which was huge. They changed his deployment time, how long it took him to deploy and set up and then get out of it. They changed his self regeneration and how that worked. They changed all kinds of things to get him there. But anyway, the other one who I was thinking, just in terms of brilliant kind of character design, is Zarya, um, as this kind of off tank. Having your character's damage directly tied to how much damage you block, I think is really cool, really brilliant. She's also kind of used as a pseudo support in being able to project her barrier onto teammates. Obviously, she's not a true support, but she can prevent huge amounts of damage, and it's an instantaneous thing, right? So with good players, you can save entirely large amounts of burst damage with her Zarya shield, which is really cool. So I think she's a really really compelling character to play, just in terms of all the different things you have to keep track of, and I think she's a really really cool stroke of character design.
Yeah, the utility of her is pretty. You can keep you on your toes. It's not a very
Very much so.
and I think mostly characters play that way, where there's multiple things you could be doing at a given time. I would say Bastion Sentry mode is sort of an exception to that, where like you're pretty much just point and click and then heal if you need to. But
Yep.
one of the characters I absolutely love is Widow, and not because
Yep.
she's a scantily clad French woman.
I mean, it doesn't hurt.
But because so she's like the sniper in the game. I mean, we have Anna, but she's more of a support role, as Greg mentioned.
Right.
Um, and they got rid of the problem of having people who were really good at no scoping with sniping. And
Yep.
basically the ability to do what is sometimes called O sniping or offensive sniping, where you charge in with a sniper and you do things that you would never do in a real combat situation with a sniper. You don't run up
Right.
to
Sniper becomes very generous term for what you're doing. It's more like a
it's like a laser shotgun type thing.
yeah. That's great. Yeah, that's a really apt description.
Where it's
For
like it
sure.
doesn't lose its accuracy. Well, like okay, there's a couple ways that games have tried to do this. Like you can have the sniper just be wildly inaccurate while
Right.
you're moving around and you're not like prone or whatever. Or
Right.
what Overwatch decided to do was allow you actually to do have that mid-range combat with an automatic gun, which I think is brilliant. Now you also brought up the point that you can't unload an entire magazine on somebody in sniper mode because of the way that the charging happens,
Right. Yep.
which I think is key to kind of limiting the effectiveness of Widow as a sniper. Because otherwise, you unload like four headshots on somebody who's unaware, and of course they're going to go down every time. It's just a matter of like
Right.
basically how fast you can click, which isn't fun.
Yeah. And that really kind of plays into just Overwatch's overall, I think, mechanical gameplay mechanic. The kind of philosophy of the developers, which is this very very clean, clever, super easy way to have fixed that dynamic to make sure that she was in fact a sniper that had to be used at range and at distance, as well as just the rest of her kit. Right, having a pseudo wall hack in her mine where you can put it down, and the second it gets triggered, you know someone's there. So that gives her, the ability to gives her kind of map awareness. And then her shift, which is a grappling hook that you can fire and just kind of jet away like Spider-Man to whatever you hook onto, is one of the best mobility uh, abilities in the game.
Yeah,
So it really, really encourages her to be played as kind of a true sniper, which is kind of a cool way of a developer to um, kind of force players into a certain playstyle with putting a character with an Overwatch. I think is entirely appropriate. And we kind of talked about that as being a bad thing in other games, with like limiting characters' ability to be creative. Um, but within Overwatch's context, I think it's really cool to have a really specific vision of the way this character should be played, and then the lateral movement, the ability to strategize of the players, comes from the way they interact with all these, all the different character picks and team compositions, which is kind of more of a MOBA esque developer stance towards the game.
yeah, the idea of team comps and everything.
Right. You don't really see people hugely innovating new ways to play characters in Overwatch, right? Characters come and go out of the meta, but in general, you don't see like this crazy new strat where with Soldier 76, like he's pretty much shoot people.
Right. Yeah.
You
Like
stay
it's
behind you.
it's the character suggests a way to play him, or pretty strongly, I would say, in the case of Overwatch. And going back to Widow for a second, like the two different ways of balancing the sniper that I mentioned. If your sniper completely loses all accuracy at close range, it feels like your sniper is just bad at close range. So like.
Yeah.
Uh, and the way that Blizzard decided to deal with this problem, your character doesn't feel nerfed. In fact, it feels like, oh my gosh, I get a machine gun and a sniper built into one. That's amazing.
Right. It
And
feels
so you
good,
don't
right?
realize that they've actually nerfed your character. Like they from
Yeah.
historically what has happened with
Yeah.
snipers. Like
Yeah. No, that's a good
if
point.
you've ever played against somebody who's good on Counter Strike with an AWP, and they would shoot you in the head without scoping, and it just felt completely unfair. You realize the problem that they were solving, and they did in fact nerf Widow
Yeah.
from what you would traditionally associate with a sniper and an arena shooter.
And I like too, like yeah, just even the visceral feeling of having both machine gun and sniper makes you, like you said, it feels good, right? It makes you feel as a character more powerful, more adept. When in reality, you're right, in kind of an absolute sense, she's not nearly as good as snipers and other
Yeah, in other
classes.
games. Hmm.
Um, exactly, which is brilliant. Like you said, that kind of Blizzard talks a lot about kind of fantasy and the fantasy of playing a character. Where if you play, you know, a character, then they really want you to feel like what you're playing. To actually have the experience of, like as Reinhardt, you feel like a giant German dude with a friggin' hammer and a giant shield. Like that you have to get that feeling, or
You feel like a bullet sponge.
exactly. Or Tracer, you actually feel like this very energy, very quick thinking, quick moving, mobile person. I was gonna say
Hmm.
British woman, which I don't know if they quite are able to nail those fantasies, but um,
Australian.
exactly. Uh, in any case, they absolutely nailed that. So let's go back to this. Originally was supposed to be a comparison between PUBG and Overwatch, as opposed to just ranting about Overwatch and how great it is. So what I think the other thing I want to at least think about with PUBG, we were kind of talking about character design, which doesn't really apply to PUBG too much, right? Your character's avatar is entirely incidental to the gameplay, right? You don't play as
Right.
different characters; you're all equal footing. So the way that they have handled, difference in just variety, basically, if everyone is exactly the same, that's not too much fun. Is via gear, right? Which Overwatch doesn't have at all. So the way
Right.
that player unknowns work is you spawn into the area and there's randomized gear across the map. Although there's certain areas that obviously have more frequent drops and people can kind of, you have a good idea of where gear will be, just not precisely what will be there and what room it'll be in basically. Um,
Hmm.
and then from there, your ability to take different actions and the way you're going to approach the game really depends on what gear you get in the beginning. So it's a cool dynamic of when you spawn in an Overwatch as a character and you spawn as Tracer, everyone knows exactly what you're going to be playing as Tracer. And player unknown, you actually, the way you're going to approach the match is actually defined partially by you and how you perform in the very beginning stages of the game, right? If depending on the choices you make as well as even how well you play, right? Like if you outplay the dude who's going for the same piece of gear as you and you get the gear, then hey, you get it. If he outplays you and you have to pull back in order so you don't die, then suddenly you're going to think about the game in a entirely different way, which I think adds a huge amount of just variety. I remember trying to explain Player Unknown to a friend and they didn't really get it because it was just one map and it was the same thing over and over, and it sounded like it would get really old really fast, and obviously it doesn't. By no means does it get old fast. So I think that like initial set of like, hey, what gear you get determines the way you're going to be strategizing, and it doesn't necessarily punish too hard. I mean, obviously you'll have some semblance of if you get the best gear and get all the things you're looking for, you're going to have an advantage. But it's not like the game isn't decided in those initial stages necessarily, which I think is a really brilliant uh, uh, line of design that they were able to successfully implement.
I think that's a brilliant observation. Like, in as much as you're handed a character and a play style in
Right.
Overwatch, just in terms of the way that the skills are designed and the way the player
Mm-hmm.
feels, uh, in PUBG, you get to make your own play style.
Yeah.
Like, if you want to if you want to trade your semi-automatic rifle for a shotgun, go for it.
Right.
Now you're a close range
Right.
person. Like you want to fight indoors, you want to be encountering people at close
Right.
quarters,
Ganking people basically.
and so you kind of get to pick how your character is going to handle. Where do you want to hold up? Do you want to hold up in a
Mm-hmm.
building? Do you want to hold up in like a
Right. Right.
ravine? Like, do you want to find some defensible position and get the high ground with a sniper? Like you can pick how you want to try and win this
Right.
game, and that's very different than Overwatch. Like as a player, actually, you've got more autonomy about how your character
Mm-hmm.
unfolds. There's more of a process, I guess, of exploration and refining
Mm-hmm.
that happens on a small scale in PUBG than there is in Overwatch, where it's pretty well set
Yeah.
what you're going to be
Gotta
doing.
know exactly what
Like,
to expect.
you're Sombra, you're going to be doing backline harass. Like, It's not anybody who's played the game really could tell you that what your
Right,
character is
right.
suited for.
And I think that's an interesting thing too. Just like psychologically to a small extent, like that's my background. But just Overwatch is so it's so everything fits into a nice box, right? In a large part, it's each map has
Hmm.
incredibly specific and well defined objectives. Each character is beautifully put together and rendered, and it's even into another category in terms of DPS tank. There's some overlap, soft tanks and dive comp being a thing, but for the most part, everyone just fits into this nice box that's very very clear on what everyone's doing, what everyone should be doing, and it's really just more about fulfilling that. And Player Unknown, it's really and just the battleground. Um, Series in general is just blown wide open, and I wonder if a big part of the reason that you have these two really distinct audiences is because the people who want to be coming in and playing something that's doesn't require. I mean, it requires a lot of skill and some creativity, but a lot less of the player to define exactly what's going to happen. With Overwatch. Versus people that want to be
Yeah.
able to get into it and feel a lot of freedom, feel tons of agency and the ability to change the way things happen. I would imagine those are two very different types of people, and what two different types of people are looking for in games, and that's why there's so little overlap between the two.
And I actually would say that it fits with the aesthetic of the game,
Yeah, sure.
which I think is fascinating. Like the idea of there are no rules, like nothing's really defined for you, very much fits with like a post-apocalyptic battle,
Totally. That's a great
right?
point.
Over resources. Like that's the position where you'd be in. There wouldn't be any boxes, there wouldn't be any rules, there wouldn't be any
Right, right,
suggestion of what you should be doing other than
right.
stay alive, which is exactly what you get in PUBG. In Overwatch, things are, if we go with a sort
Right.
of optimistic, although I know it's not conflict free, a more
Yeah,
well crafted future where things
sure.
haven't all fallen apart, where there is going to be structure and there is going to be direction for
Hmm.
people.
Interesting, dude. That's a really cool thought. I like that. That just the kind of intersection of the aesthetic of the game and then precisely the experience of playing it.
Hmm.
I doubt that was intentional, even. I think that probably just happened through well designed games, probably will reflect their own, what they're going for. And that even kind of plays into the fantasy aspect too, right? Like, if you really want to be creating an experience, you have to have your aesthetic and what you're going to be doing be matching up to a certain extent.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
that's another kind of side note, but on Left 4 Dead, right? That they do a fantastic job at that. You really feel like you are one of four people barely getting by surviving a zombie apocalypse,
Yeah.
and aesthetically and mechanically they put all these things into place to make you feel that way, and it does. So that's the really point. That's probably why I don't play Pale Unknowns.
Yeah.
Moment of personal revelation.
That's a good point, which is when your game offers a very specific experience, you're going to risk turning away people who don't want that experience,
Totally.
which is
Yeah.
okay. Like you, as a designer, design a specific experience,
Mhm.
and there are lots of experiences that some people like and other people don't.
Totally.
I don't know if I'll ever go skydiving, and yet there are thriving skydiving businesses all over the world.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, and so just because some people don't like your experience, that actually is you should count on that.
Hmm.
Like you should have a niche.
Yeah. It's probably important for designers to remember too that there are other people who are not like them out there, right? Like if you're designing, obviously not being a game designer myself, you probably should be designing something that you're excited about and would want to play yourself, but also you can't let your own instincts necessarily steer every design choice, right? Because you got to take into account the fact that not everyone who's going to be playing your game is exactly like you and will enjoy different things. It sounds kind of simple, but my guess is that'd be a very easy trap to fall into as a designer to be like, ah, no, this isn't too fun, but not actually recognizing the fact that hey, there's people who aren't you who will be playing this and probably enjoy very different things than you. It's probably why playtesting is so important.
Yeah, so you actually let other people have the experience and get feedback. Um, you've told me about even in creation of narratives how writers should feel like their characters at time push against
Right.
them because it's not the character's personality or their traits aren't convenient for where the writer wants to take the
Yeah.
story. And I think game designers can find themselves in a similar
Sure.
position where they've really identified the core experience that they want the player to have, and they also have this really cool idea of a mechanic But if the mechanic doesn't enhance the experience, that might get scrapped later on, and to the chagrin of the original designer. But if they really want to be faithful to that experience, they might actually have to get rid of this.
They have to be able to let go of that kind of. Yeah. No, that's a good point. Well, cool. I'd say the last piece I'd love to talk about, especially having kind of compared and contrast a little bit, would be the sound design aspect of both games and how sound is so important in both of them.
Yeah, we could
Um,
talk about sound design.
Particularly just a visceral level. I don't know if you've played much in Overwatch. There's an arcade, which is separate from kind of the normal competitive and quick play modes, where you just play with the normal mode of the game. There's an arcade mode, which has all these different game types that you don't play competitively, but can just kind of hop into. One of them is a duelist mode, where you there's actually two versions of this. There's a basically a random mode where you'll get a mirror character where both players will spawn in, and it's just the two of you on the map, and you both play the same character, and you just have to whoever wins. Or there's another one which is kind of cool where it gives you a choice of three heroes. You both get the same choice of three heroes, and you have to pick one of three, and then you spawn in and fight. And you do this. I think it's first one to win 5 rounds.
Hmm.
But anyway, all that's to say, those maps are I've experienced the visceral terror of hearing footsteps are really important, and every single character in Overwatch has a unique footstep sound based on
Hmm.
their weight and the way they move. And I've had many times where it's in that 1v1 scenario, kind of this hunter killer mechanic mindset, and you can hear particularly May's footsteps just scare the crap out of me because she's just a terrifying character to play against. But where you're kind of crouching in some corner listening to this person walking around, it's actually kind of unnerving. Um, and I think that's fantastic. That's so fun to have to have both an important gameplay mechanic, because obviously knowing location is super important to get the drop on someone, but also to viscerally make you feel uneasy and unnerved depending on the character. Right, you hear this huge clamping, plodding footsteps of Roadhog running around, or you hear the tiny little pitter patter of Genji's feet, and you instantly know which one's which, and feel appropriate feelings in regards to them. I think
Hmm.
it's brilliant.
The fact that you can tell so much from just the sound. I mean, it goes back to the character design, but that they put in a lot of thought into how they were going to shape these characters and how that was going to impact the game.
Mm.
Um, and one of the things that really highlighted the sound design in Overwatch for me was when the game tooltip mentions that enemy sounds are louder than allied sounds,
Yeah,
which is a small thing, and it's artificial in a way that we'll talk about PUBG wouldn't
right,
do. That would be against, I think, the design and the experience that PUBG is going
right.
for. But Overwatch, being they have a little bit more flexibility with the fantastical aspect of what they can do with the sound
Totally.
design, and so the fact that you have enhanced hearing for the enemy is cool in terms of it's a dimension in which they can balance the game, um, and it draws attention to the sounds of the enemy team.
Mm-hmm.
It makes you notice that this character design and the sound design that they put a lot of work into.
Mm-hmm. I mean, even stuff as simple as getting shot at by an enemy Widowmaker and hearing that ping and that buzz when it's getting close,
Hmm.
or just hearing, not being able to see her, but hearing the tracer teleports, the little blinks, the yippee, like those. That sound a little bit more like Anthem, so I want, but um, that sort of thing, and how seamlessly, right? Like, think about just ways to convey information. There's no mini map, there's no radar, there's very very sparse UI in Overwatch, which I think is fantastic and really plays into this kind of sleek design that Blizzard was going for it. But a really really and very natural. I doubt many people even think about it, and they probably utilize it very much in their playing. Players probably are not particularly aware of the fact that sound is being used so much. But obviously, think about wasting information in a video game. You pretty much have sound and sight, and being able to utilize sound not just as a way to kind of give a little bit more depth to the feeling, but to actually give really important information that you'd be like. Try playing Overwatch without sound. It's actually really really hard, almost impossible, because you get so much out of it, which is a really cool thing.
Yeah, just think about the fact that every character in their alt has got. I don't know about every character. Actually, I haven't thought through all of them, but most of them yell
Well,
something.
everyone says something, but almost all of them actually have two distinct ones, where one will be for your own team and one will be for the other team. So you don't even have to. Yeah. So if you have two soldiers and you hear, "I've got you in my sights" versus tactical advisor engaged, you know which one's which. So if you hear tactical advisor engaged, you don't have to freak out, go for cover. If you're a guy in my sights, that means you're about to die. Um, so that sort of thing. It's actually cool. Another little thing they did, which is in general, if a character ults on your team, then they will say their line in English. And if a character ults on the enemy team and they are not a native English speaker, they'll actually say their alt phrase just in their native tongue. So Zarya says the same line when she uses her Graviton Surge. She'll say it in Russian if it's the enemy team, and she'll say it in English if team. Widowmaker's the same. Same thing with Mei. Mercy is another one. Although I think sometimes Mercy will say the Helden stirbt nicht in as a friendly player as well. But anyway, that's another really cool just little tweak they did to again convey huge amounts of information just very very naturally and very intuitively.
Well, in player unknowns, sound is also extremely important because you're trying to.
Right.
That's actually a lot more of what you were talking about on that one arcade mode, where you're trying to get the jump because having the first shot is an extremely large advantage.
Yeah.
In player unknowns, that's like almost the whole game is like that, where you want to be the person who gets the drop. Because it's not as team based, although I know you can be on teams in PUBG. It's more survive yourself or in a small group, and you're not as resilient. There's no mercy sitting next to you if you make a mistake. Like you want to be the one to shoot first, and you want to not have any fire back if you can help it.
And that's in large part the strategy of the game, right? Is particularly the main game mechanic, which we haven't really touched on to anyone who doesn't know, but the main big difference for player unknowns, as far as I can tell from other battlegrounds, is the mechanic of forcing you into the center I think it's every like 2 minutes, 4 minutes. The battleground will shrink actually, so the map doesn't shrink, but there will be a line, a large circle that will continually shrink, and if you're outside of that circle, you take it's kind of a weird, contrived way to do it in some ways. It doesn't really fit into the fantasy thing, but you just get electrocuted continuously until you die. Everything just becomes electricity. So, so that's kind of the main gameplay mechanic to ensure that people just don't camp out indefinitely and just become a waiting game. You continually get forced into smaller and smaller areas, and the big strategy there, as a player, is to, as that time period is happening, there's very clear, as well as countdowns to when the area is going to be constricting. To basically to find a good place right inside where the new limit's gonna be, and to look out over the no man's land where it's gonna be constricting, and watch as people obviously have to break from their old locations and get into the new one. So if you beat them to that location and then look out and face toward, you don't face in, you actually want to face outwards to try to get the pick on people who are coming in, because that's the most vulnerable point of the game, right? Is running in between safe zones where damage is going to be assured on one end. So that's a very really cool way to make that happen. In terms of the sound-based stuff too, like just guns are loud, similar to the real world, so being the one to shoot first obviously has the advantage of getting the drop and getting a kill, but it also alerts everyone in a very large radius to where you are, and opens you up to the potential of then getting counter engaged.
Right.
So.
And I think that's a much more
For sure.
significant part of PUBG's sound design than it is in Overwatch. Like the cavernous boom and the echo is much more significant in PUBG because it's a much bigger field you're trying to find players on. Like if you hear just general gunfire in an Overwatch match, it's like, well, clearly the match has started.
Right, yeah, exactly.
Like that's pretty much all it tells you. Even before the match has started, sometimes there's gunfire. Like it just doesn't hardly tell you anything. Now footsteps, when you start hearing the smaller noises, that can help you to pinpoint specific players. But in terms of just general gunfire, it's way more significant in PUBG because there's just less of it. There isn't going to be a 15-minute long firefight in PUBG. It's very, very short engagements.
Yep.
And so when you hear somebody engaging, it's much more significant. So I would say that the long distance sound design on PUBG is much more important.
Yeah, and certainly obviously the other major game mechanic difference, right? That you respawn when you die in Overwatch, and you don't do that in PUBG. That's the whole point. So when you hear a combat huging, that's huge, right? That's the most important part of the game. When you hear combat happening in Overwatch, like you said, you're like, great, like duh. So that's hugely important. It's cool that two very very similar, again, just like two very similar, mechanics, which is hearing gunfire, have just massively, massively different consequences, and they convey huge very different amounts of information.
Yeah, because if you hear gunfire in Overwatch and it doesn't isn't related to the
Mm.
objective at all, it's almost like a distraction. It's like, why are they
Yep.
over there fighting? Like they're not even by the
Right.
objective. Like, they maybe these people need to come join their teams and like get back
Yeah.
involved with the match. Whereas in PUBG, you would never think that because you'd think, oh, somebody's being
Right.
eliminated. Like, I wonder if there's going to be a survivor that
Exactly.
I can pick off because the
Right.
combat is everything.
Goal
Like,
survival.
because your goal is to survive. It's
Right.
indirectly everything because if you aren't aware of combat, then you're gonna
Right.
die.
And I love that mechanic too, especially and how it changes throughout the course of the game with PUBG. If you hear combat, most of the time you always have the choice of either going towards it and trying to, like you say, pick off stragglers, maybe win something they're fighting over, a vehicle, a piece of gear, or to just run the other direction. Like you know exactly where the danger is, you're getting out of there,
Right.
and that's hard. And you have to change that strategy. Little player choice that happens every single time you hear that. And in fact, also changes with the amount of time left in the game and the amount of people left. You begin to have to get more aggressive and more desperate, or take advantage of those situations a little bit more, as if you really want to be winning, which is impressive, by the way. I don't know. That's the other thing. Like right, like with Overwatch, your goal is always to win the match, always. Um, PUBG, like there's 100 players and usually 1 to 3 winners, right? However many people are
Hmm.
in a team. I think there's a team limit of 4. And so to win makes you literally 1 out of 100, which is not great chances. So my guess is the mass majority of player unknown players don't win most of their matches. Like winning's actually probably a very rare occurrence, um, as opposed to Overwatch, which is like, yeah, you shoot to win every single time, and when you lose, it feels really bad. In Player
Right.
Unknown, if you lose, probably doesn't feel great, but it's also not like just devastating, because the chances of winning are just very small.
Yeah, you've got to appreciate being the 20th person left alive versus the 60th.
Exactly.
Like,
Yeah.
otherwise, there's no way. Just the feeling of a
Yeah. The
reward
return
or
is
like
non-existent. Yeah.
the return is be terrible
Right.
because you win. On average, and if you were playing with people who are identical skill level, you'd win 1% of the
Right.
time.
Exactly.
Like,
Yeah. And no one wants to play that game.
yeah, exactly. That's not a, if you're just looking at being first, it's a very bleak
Yes.
outlook.
Yeah. Very much so. That's interesting. Well, we're almost done here. You want to finish up just talking about you? You had a really cool point about just the perspectives of like the first person, third person ideas, and how that plays into the identity of the games, and even how they're approached.
So obviously, PlayerUnknown's is primarily third person, as Greg mentioned, and Overwatch is first person. And even psychologically, what this does is a third person perspective is going to remove you from the action. You're watching as a player, and of course, you're involved with what's happening. But I think it encourages you to think a little bit more tactically and strategically about what's happening on the screen,
Yep.
because you don't have the same feeling in a first person of being right in the action.
Right.
I think MOBAs take advantage of this too, and it's one of the, I would say, reasons why Smite feels and plays quite different than a game like Dota 2,
Totally.
uh, because you are right in the action. And I would say that probably the strategic play in Smite it suffers because of that. Because you are so focused on what's happening in the world of your
Killing
character.
creeps.
Whereas in PUBG, as we mentioned, map awareness is huge, even though you don't have a heads up display that shows you where all the players are.
Hmm.
So you've got to use your ears and your eyes in order to ascertain where things are happening and where you should
Yeah.
go. And so I think that the more strategic and slow pace is supported by the third person camera.
Totally.
In Overwatch, it's very fast paced.
Totally.
You're in the action. If you ever die, you get out of the action. You want to get back in quickly. You have it's much more fast pace. Um, and so I would say that first person really supports that, even just again mentally, of you being in the character's shoes, fast paced, aggressive style of play. You can be reckless in Overwatch, and you can't be reckless in PUBG.
Totally. Yeah. It very much just encourages, even on that kind of maybe even slightly unconscious level, that being in that aggression, that movement, it literally puts you behind the eyes of the person, and you feel every step a little bit differently than you do as this more removed kind of puppet master in a third person situation, which obviously, like you said, just very naturally. I wonder, it'd be a fascinating and something that I'd never ever get funded. But just looking at brain functionality between a first person third person game, just in terms of where it lights up, if kind of the amygdala and aggressive emotional responses light up higher on Overwatch, and far more frontal cortex rational thinking areas would be a lot brighter just in an fMRI or something like that in player unknowns.
Yeah,
Because
I think that would be fascinating to find out. I think um,
in a perfect world where we could just
we
have
can do whatever research we
access.
want. Yeah.
Exactly.
I have an fMRI. You don't have one?
Yeah, right. Yeah,
I'll get you one for
some
Christmas.
most hospitals can't afford one. Actually, those machines are insane.
One thing I wanted to mention, the fact that in shooters, we talked about MOBAs and the high entry barrier.
Yeah.
And I think that shooters actually have a good thing going for it when it comes to entry barrier. And that's because AI for shooters
Hmm.
is easy to design. It's and some people might be cringing. There are definitely things about shooter AI that are difficult, but in order to make a good shooter AI, if you can make an aimbot, then you've already made a character that's pretty hard to kill, even if he doesn't move, which is like, I mean, movement is obviously significant. Positioning does matter. There is strategy for
Right.
these things, but a lot of that can actually be you can compensate with just by having really sick, good aim. And I would say that the Overwatch AI does
Right.
do this. I have watched the death cameras. I have seen them aiming at me,
Right.
and I'm like, wow, that is a steady hand you have there, sir. Uh, and of course it is because as a computer you can have an infinitely steady hand.
Right.
Computers were literally made to launch artillery shells, so they've been doing this for a while. And
Really?
yes,
Seriously? You can trace computing back to artillery
yeah,
calculations?
artillery calculations back in World War
No
II.
way.
Yeah,
I
the
did
ENIAC
not
was
know
one of the
that.
very first machines to do that.
No
But
way.
so they're very good at,
Well, that's
aiming things. They've been doing it for a
sinister.
long time.
Why
Uh,
do we trust machines?
yeah, right.
It's
And so I would say that by creating an AI that is good, that feels challenging, admittedly in a different way than humans are challenging when playing a
Mhm.
first-person shooter, but still challenging.
Especially for an objective one like
Um,
Overwatch, right? I mean, it's actually very hard to program an Overwatch strategy to AI.
yes, yes. So strategy is difficult, but in terms of just like surviving and winning firefights,
Right.
I'd say that the AI prepares you pretty well in Overwatch because the aim is unrealistically good and the awareness is unrealistically good. Like a human might not be paying much attention. A human might get distracted by a firefight going on to
Right.
to their right, and not hear that you're walking up behind them. Computer is not going to do that. They're going to know every time when your little head's poking out as Widow, they're going to shoot you in the face, and you're like, "How did you know I was there, Zenyatta?"
Sweet. Well, I think we're right about at time here.
Yeah, this is good. We clearly had a lot to talk about
Totally.
because there's so much, and these are both good games. Go play both of them, see what you think.
Wait.
Um, Next week we will be back talking about Left 4 Dead, the craziness that game inspires in our lives currently.
Yes, and succeeds, and it's brilliant. I love it. I remember playing it as when I was younger, when it released, and enjoying it. But since this past week, where we've been getting together with another friend and playing, it's been like, oh, it's so good, so good.
Cool. Signing off.
Sweet man, sounds good.
See you.
Peace.
If you enjoyed this episode of Gaming Mechanics, check out our Twitter at Gaming Mechanics or our Facebook by going to facebook.com/gamingmechanics. Thanks for listening.